Thank you for joining us today for Marie Selby Botanical Gardens Historical Briefing. This is going to be a fun program on boats, bays, and the Bayfront sanctuaries. I love that John has a picture of a boat right there in his screen behind him, which is very proper for today. And we're going to learn so much. I'm really looking forward to this and think it's going to be a great program. So everyone, please join me in welcoming John McCarthy, our regional vice president, or our vice president for regional history. Sorry, got that a little backwards. We have one question already, John, while we're waiting, if you want to start out with, when was the publication dates of the Sarasota Sun paper?
The Sarasota Sun was a very short-lived paper. I think there's only one surviving edition of it, and that is from June of 1913. But I think it ran for 2 years. It was published by a gentleman named Rube Allen. And he tried to start it up on the Bayfront of Sarasota, and then he went to haul his printing press to Siesta Key, and unfortunately the boat overturned and he lost the press in the bay.
Well, that really went well with boats and Bayfront sanctuaries. So interesting. Well, we're going to begin our program now. So John, we're ready to hear from you. And when it's time for questions, I'll chime in with some that have come in from our viewers.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Marlo, for joining me today. And as I get started, I want to thank Jennifer Romanecki, our president and CEO, for inviting me to do this program. Inspired by the Set Sail with Selby cruises. These have been exceptionally popular. What a great idea. We have 10 miles of waterway between the downtown Sarasota campus and the historic Spanish Point campus. Why not connect them by boat and expand our horizons, so to speak? And so this has been a highly successful tour, but we thought it would be nice to share with our audience the history of the 3 bays that we travel through, because it's amazing within that 10 miles of beautiful bayfront, there's just so much history and so much nature, and that's what we're all about here at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. So again, what we're going to do today is I want to thank some of the folks that contribute images for these programs, because there's Florida Memory, which is Florida Department of State, that has beautiful photographs available for use. Newspaper Archive I use to go back and do a lot of research. Wikimedia Commons contributed 1 image for the program today, and many of the images come out of the county collection at Library and Historical Resources. And then I kind of have my own little collection of photos that I can add in when I need something special. So today's program, we're going to break into 3 parts, and we're going to talk about a little history of Sarasota Bay. Then we're going to talk about Roberts Bay down behind Siesta Key, and then Little Sarasota Bay taking us all the way down to Spanish Point. And we're going to have opportunity for questions after each of these sections. And so, you know, Sarasota Bay is this massive inland waterway, very wide, very long, stretches all the way basically from the Siesta Drive Bridge all the way up to Tampa Bay. And so Sarasota Bay is kind of the famous big bay. And, you know, the first people to boat on Sarasota Bay, Roberts Bay, and Little Sarasota Bay were the Native Americans, the indigenous Floridians, who used the waterways as a way to travel, navigate, trade, harvest fish and seafood and all those other good things. And so we can't forget that we have thousands of years of boating and bayfront tradition and heritage in our 2 bayfront campuses. The era of Spanish exploration brought these huge ships to the shoreline, something that, you know, the natives had never seen before. And but these ships were so large that they couldn't get close to the shallow waters and actually explore. So all of these large vessels carried what was called a longboat. And the longboat was the ship's boat, and it was used to carry water and provisions out to the ships and onto shore, could hold about 20 men. It was powered by oars, and in many cases had a windlass where they could take the anchor from the ship and run it way out in front and then pull the ship with it if they had to get out of a harbor. You know, these are the days long before any motorized. And the reason why I include the Longboat here is because we have an island named Longboat Key that kind of frames the west shore of Sarasota Bay. And I think it's important for people to have an understanding of where these names come from. And back in the day, they actually found a longboat embedded in the sand of Longboat Key. What was amazing is that they had already been calling it Longboat Key before they found the boat. But if we take a look at this map that's over 200 years old, this was drawn by British cartographer Bernard Romans. It actually shows, and I'll use my cursor to try to point it out, this long island here from where it says Boca Sarasota or mouth into Sarasota. This is all Longboat Key, and back in the 1700s, it was called Palm Island. If you could imagine just an island filled with cabbage palms, and so thus it has its name. And Sarasota Bay, back in this era, was named by Romans Palm Sound, the water behind the Palm Island. Now, Lido was not a separate island yet. That didn't happen until the 1870s. Also on this map, we have Siesta Key, just south of Boca Sarasota, which is Big Pass, the Big Deepwater Pass. And Siesta Key at this time is called Clam Island. And there were places there in the bay that were exceptionally good for clamming, and hence that name. So it's fascinating to me to see this era of the 1700s. The people that were living here were mostly fishermen from the island of Cuba, who had established outposts, or what they called fishing ranchos, along the shoreline. And this is an image that kind of depicts a palm thatched hut right there on the water's edge, and a what's called a smack, fishing smack, which is a type of sailboat. And this is the type of sailboat that would have sailed from here to Key West, just laden with barrels of dried mullet, dried and salted mullet. This was a huge part of our economy in the area. I wanted to include this map from the 1850s because it's the only one that I've ever seen that actually shows Hudson's house, the gentleman that Hudson Bayou is named for. Now, Hudson, you don't hear a lot about him because he was gone by the 1860s, but he was a resident here in the 1850s. And this map also shows the Snell House, which could have just as easily been labeled the Whitaker House up on Whitaker Bayou. And then also Philippe's house, or Philippe's Rancho, Felipe Bermudez, who had his rancho down where Cherokee Park is today. Map also shows the north end of Siesta Key. And it's funny because you see these connecting routes, almost like roads, from Philippi to Woodruff's place on Siesta Key to up to Whitaker's place. And then at this point, in the 1850s, they're calling Longboat Sarasota Island, and they're calling it Sarasota Bay. This is an early image of Sarasota Bay up along the Indian Beach area. So named because of the amount of the Indian shell mounds that were discovered by the original developer, and he was fascinated by that, so he called it Indian Beach. And again, you see tremendous amount of palm trees, so you could understand why the early explorers would have called this Palm Sound. And then the little sailboat out there in the water. Almost all the early images of Sarasota show boats in some form or fashion because this is how you got around. Now, this is a U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey map from 1883, and I love these old maps because I like to see the contrast between the way it looked in 1880s and the way it looks now. And so if you look at this map, you see New Pass up here separating Longboat from Lido. That opened in the 1870s, and the surveyors asked somebody what it was called, and they said, well, it was a new pass. So that name stuck, and we're still calling it New Pass here, 150 years later. Lido had not quite consolidated into a singular island at this point. That didn't happen until seemingly the hurricane in 1921 pushed a lot of sand up on this island. It kind of consolidated all this. But if you can see where my cursor is in the middle, this is St. Armand's Key. And the bathing beach for Sarasota, like in 1910, was you went out to St. Armand's and you bathed right here where my cursor is in this little protected shallow water area. That was the bathing beach. Here's Otter Key, Coon Key, Bird Key in a much smaller size. What we call Golden Gate Point was called Cedar Point. You've got Hudson Bayou down here, and a little place called Post Office Point, which is Harbor Acres or Hillview Drive, also with an Indian shell mound extending out into the bay. You see the northern end of Siesta Key called Fishery Point. You see Sarasota Pass. I think we've got a closer up view of this just because I wanted to show you again Hudson Bayou. Little bridge across Hudson Bayou as early as 1883. You see some little citrus groves up here. What's now downtown Sarasota was not developed at all at this point. All the action was really down south of Hudson Bayou. But you can see these little groves And again, the post office point, which was the post office was down here, and the mail came in by boat, landed at the Indian Mound, and they walked into the post office itself. 1886 brought a lot of change to the Sarasota Bay in that a Scottish corporation started developing downtown Sarasota. And this was kind of one of the first promotional photographs for Sarasota, showing the DeSoto Hotel that they built and the dock. And again, it's got a boat in there and the bayfront. And this is how Sarasota was promoted to people really all over the world, was come and enjoy the bay. By the 1890s, so many people were coming here that John Saveries, who ran a huge fish camp in Tampa, decided to extend steamer service to Sarasota 3 times a week. So this started in 1895. The federal government had done some dredging up in the northern part of Sarasota Bay, allowing this type of, albeit large but shallow draft vessel to get through. And the Mistletoe was Sarasota's link to the outside world, ran 3 times a week between Tampa and Sarasota for over a decade. Got rebuilt at one time and rechristened the city of Sarasota when the city became a city. And this is how many, many people came to Sarasota before the railroad, and was a major influence in our development. And then just this neat little scene of where you would have wandered down Lower Main Street to the dock to get out on that Mistletoe steamer and go your way. But you see all these small sailboats and workboats, and really a maritime culture around downtown Sarasota and Sarasota Bay. And I had mentioned the dredging of the channels. This is the USS Florida. This is a dredge that was owned by the federal government. It did some of the early work here, including in 1911 when they kind of opened up the channel in Roberts Bay. And not connected in any way to Roberts Bay, but George Roberts was a boat builder here in Sarasota for a number of years. And at one point he hooked up with a gentleman named W.W. Stanton, who worked for the Seaboard Airline Railroad. And actually Stanton had purchased J. Hamilton Gillespie's house, Palm Place. If you saw my last program on the gardens of the region, you'll know that Gillespie's was the first formal garden developed in the Sarasota area. So Stanton became the owner of that garden after Gillespie sold it to him. And they built this boat works. This is on Gulfstream Avenue, just north of Main Street, with the Marine Railways crossing Gulfstream Avenue. So again, cars were not such a big deal back then, but boats had to be worked on and built and fixed up and launched back in the water. This photograph's from approximately 1912. I just found it about a week ago, and it is an amazing photograph. I just love seeing all the different types of boats, the work boats, and a lot of these boats were former sailboats converted to gasoline around the turn of the century. And then this is one of my favorites because this is a great example of that. This is an example of a catboat sailboat that was demasted and outfitted with a gasoline engine and renamed Kitty. Get it? It's a catboat. And Kitty ran up in Sarasota. Kitty would take you over to, the islands and take you out in the bay fishing. And boy, they really loaded people up on Kitty. And if you're looking at Kitty saying that you recognize Kitty, maybe it's because Kitty is just like the Magic that we have down at Spanish Point. This is the original Magic. That was the Webb's boat that would take passengers from Sarasota to the Webb's Winter Resort. And it too was a catboat, demasted and outfitted with a gasoline engine. And so it's just amazing. These were the types of tour boats that you enjoyed back in the day. And then I thought this shot was great because it's so rare to see an aerial photograph from the 1920s. There weren't that many airplanes here, but this one kind of shows that expansive aspect of Sarasota Bay and then looking south. And so if you follow my cursor south from the Main Street dock, which is in the center, to the railroad or the fish dock, where the railroad went right out into the bay to get the fish, to the Hudson Bayou, and you see the Selby estate right here on the far left. You can practically see the Selby house right here. And then here's the post office point, the Harbor Acres. This is before it was all dredged and modified after World War II. And then this is the original Siesta Drive Bridge going over to Siesta, and then Roberts Bay beyond. So I just think that's kind of a cool photograph. Of course, Marie Selby and Bill Selby, they were boaters. They had a number of boats. This one, which is simply named Bilma on the transom for Bill and Marie, was actually, I think, called Bilma Jr. And this was an express cruiser that Marie used to race, and she won the powerboat race here in 1928 in this boat. So I think that's just fantastic. But you have to realize that back in the early days, you had a boat either because you worked on the water or because you were wealthy. And the 1950s, post World War II, that kind of changed. And all of a sudden now you could buy a little Chris Craft boat, or you could buy any number of smaller boats where anyone could become a boater, essentially. And I love some of these photographs because like this one in particular, can anyone out there put in the chat where this photograph was taken? You got to take a close look at it. But this is very late 1950s or early 1960s, and I love it because it's such a stylish little fiberglass, runabout out here, and the kids are obviously having a good time. But if you think you know where this is, put it in the chat, and maybe somebody wants to ask me later, and I'll tell you. I want to come back to that little map for a while because I want to now focus on a few of the things that if you're sharp, when you're out on the Set Sail with Selby tour, you'll notice them. So we have Bird Island in the middle of the bay, which is now Bird Key. And back then, Bird Key had this wonderful mansion on it. And so again, you might recall this slide from our Gardens of the Region program, which is on our website, by the way, if you didn't have a chance to see it. But this was one of the beauty sites of Sarasota. Now you look out at Bird Key and there's like 100 homes out there, and they all have gardens too. So check that out. And then if as you look out toward Big Pass and the north end of Siesta Key, this is the Siesta Post Office from like 1913. It was out on a dock. And the real estate office was at the start of the dock. So you had to go through the real estate office to get out to the post office. Pretty neat. And then this is the ferry boat that would take you from downtown Sarasota out to the Bay Island Hotel or out to Siesta, Bay Island being that northern portion of Siesta before you go across the Humpback Bridge. And this is an awesome little boat. And next to it is a little power boat also outfitted with an inboard gasoline engine. You see, it's a free boat and it'll take you to the Bay Island Hotel. And this is the Bay Island Hotel. And the only thing left today that you can see from the water is this lamp post off to the right-hand side. That is actually still there. The rest of the building burned, I think, in the 1940s. Here's the kind of welcoming little garden setting with the benches and the kind of the gazebo there that welcomed you when you went to the Bay Island Hotel. So that kind of wraps up Sarasota Bay. And before we swing on down to Roberts Bay, we want to pause and take any questions that you have.
Okay, so I'm going to give out some answers that have come in to your trivia question. One person said I may mispronounce that, Lyman Lapstrake. Is that the kind of boat, I'm wondering?
Yeah, I think that's a Lyman. I mean, I said Chris Craft. Lyman was another very common brand, and Lapstrake is the way the boards overlap on the planks overlap on the side. So I think that the person who's indicated that is correct. That's more than likely a Lyman.
Okay, and then as far as location, here are 3 comments. One is Lido Key, one is the hospital, and one is Sandcastle Resort. And then I have a question that doesn't go with this
Okay.
section.
Well, let's talk about that last photograph with the fiberglass boat and the mother and presumably her children. That was taken right off of Selby Gardens, looking at Bayfront, Sarasota. I almost feel like we should go back to it real quick.
I think you should go back.
Yeah, we'll go back to it. It's worth going back to, folks. And Gulfstream Towers is the only condo on the Bayfront at this time. So Gulfstream Towers is all by itself, but this is right after the State Road Department put in the Bayfront Drive. And I just think it's an amazing photograph to see Sarasota like that.
That's a good one. I like it. 2 questions, John. One, somebody asked about the cost to do Sail with Selby. Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to take that?
Sure. I know we've got some changes with the tours. And so, sure, Marlo, go ahead and share.
So currently, Sail with Selby takes place on Saturdays. You leave the downtown Sarasota campus at 10 a.m. and take about an hour and 15-minute boat ride. And it's beautiful. I did it on the coldest day of the year and had the best time. You're going to see all kinds of wildlife, dolphins, birds. You learn some marine points of interest, get to really check out what's happening down the bay. And then you arrive at our beautiful historic Spanish Point campus, where you have a voucher to use at the food truck for some food and can explore that campus at your leisure. And then everybody gathers back and rides the boat back to downtown campus, and you arrive here around 3 o'clock. So it's a wonderful way to spend the day. For members, the cost is $115. Not yet members, the cost is $125. And if that's a little too much for you, maybe you don't want to be gone all day, we do have the opportunity to take part in the Magic, which is the smaller boat. And that will run in the fall when it's a little bit cooler. And I think the cost is around $40. I don't remember specifically. But we have it on our website and we can help you if you want to call and talk to the membership department, which is my department. We'll be happy to help you with that. So the other question, John, that you can answer for us before we move on is, did the mistletoe boat go through the bulkhead to get into Sarasota Bay?
The mistletoe actually ran from Tampa, stopping at the Manatee River, stopping at Cortez, Longboat. It did not go out into the Gulf of Mexico. It was in the inland waterway. There was a shoal up near the Manatee River that had to get cut in 1895 to allow it to get through. You know, I actually thought someone might ask me, well, whatever happened to the mistletoe? Well, the mistletoe actually ran for decades and ultimately was scrapped, but the propeller off of mistletoe is actually up at the Florida Maritime Museum in Cortez, next to the old schoolhouse. And it's amazing that at least the propeller survived from the 1890s all the way up through today. All right, shall we get started on Roberts Bay?
Yeah,
So folks, as we kind of leave Sarasota Bay, we kind of leave Bird Key behind and the Sarasota shoreline. We can see Siesta. We go under the Siesta Dry Bridge and we're in Roberts Bay. Now, Roberts Bay is named for a guy named Captain Lewis Roberts, who was a native of Key West. He was a true Florida conch, as they call him. And he moved up into the Sarasota area in the 1880s and settled out on what at the time was called Sarasota Key. So remember, before we said Siesta was called Clam Island, then it was called Little Sarasota Key, then it was called Sarasota Key, and then, believe it or not, the entire island wasn't called Siesta until 1954, but the name Siesta was applied to the north end in 1907 through real estate development of Harry Heigl and Captain Lewis Roberts. And so this is Captain Lewis Roberts' sailboat called the Nemo, and this is offshore Sarasota's Bayfront. And here is the second bridge out to Sarasota Key, or Siesta Key, as we call it today. They're actually, the bridge that's there now is the third bridge. But what was interesting, when they put the first bridge in, the boat traffic was free to go through at any time. And when you wanted to drive your car across, they'd close it to the boat traffic. So it's kind of interesting. The boats kind of ruled at the beginning. And anyway, this is a beautiful image of that bridge. And now, as soon as we go under the bridge, we're in Roberts Bay. And here's a photograph. I just wanted to show you Captain Lewis Roberts is depicted in the back here. I put a little yellow arrow above him. He's just to the left of the guy whose tie is flying to the side. And wanted to give you an image of the guy who this place was named for, you know. And he and his wife started a hotel, probably informally in the 1890s, but by 1906, they had the Siesta Hotel here out on Roberts Point. So this was on the Bayfront on Roberts Point Road, as you can imagine. And you see all the hotel guests out here. It's quite a nice large hotel with the beautiful verandas. And they advertised free rowboats. You could go do all the fishing you wanted. Clams, oysters, whelks, and conchs in abundance. You know, this is how the advertising went for the place. And then this was their bathing beach. And this was simply going from the hotel straight across to the Gulf Beach. And this would be where the Shell Road beach is today, where it is very much eroded and looks very different than it did back in the day. But this, like St. Armands, was one of Sarasota's most popular bathing beaches right there at Shell Road, associated with the Roberts Point development. And I should add that Captain Lewis Roberts met a young woman here in Sarasota who actually had been born on the Atlantic Ocean and had come to Sarasota with her father, Peter Hansen. And Peter Hansen lived on Quail Drive. This is his boat, the Lark. He and his wife named their daughter Ocean because she was born on the Atlantic Ocean. And the road on Siesta Key, Ocean Boulevard, is named for her, not for the water. So there's a little Siesta trivia for you. And then I want to go back again to the 1883 map because I think it works splendidly at doing this and show you some of the landmarks you're going to see when you get into Roberts Bay, because you come through the causeway that's up here at the top, and you immediately get into a kind of a confined space there. This used to be called Clam Bar, and this is where everybody went clamming back in the early days on these little sandbars, these little islands that were kind of blocking access into Roberts Bay. And in 1911, they did one cut through here. And sometimes if the captain has a high enough tide on the return trip, he'll take the boat through that old 1911 cut, and you're going through this super narrow waterway amongst what became known as Edwards Islands, named for Arthur Britton Edwards, who was an early Sarasota pioneer, real estate developer, insurance man. Actually, the person credited with showing Bertha Palmer the property down at what is now historic Spanish Point campus. And so we kind of evolved from Clam Bar to Edwards Islands. But then look just south of there, these three little islands here are still there. Those are the bird rookery islands. That's where you'll see the roseate spoonbills, the white pelicans in season, all types of egrets and herons and ibis, and everything is out there. And they were there back in the 1880s, almost just the way they are today. And so this is all Roberts Bay through here. And then Roberts Bay kind of terminates at Philippi Creek at this place called the Mangroves. And again, this is where you go from an expansively wide Roberts Bay down into a narrow tunnel that takes you through an artificial dredge cut through the mangroves. Now, if you look at this, you'll see that historically, if you wanted to go overland to Siesta Key, you just went there. You went through the mangroves. So before they had bridges, if you wanted to get over there by cart or by foot, you just went through the mangroves. This was also a major impediment to navigation, as was Clam Bar. And many picnics that were held down at Stickney Point on a Sunday afternoon, when they tried to get back to Sarasota, the tide wasn't high enough, and they'd end up spending the night either in the mangroves or at Clam Bar, and then get up in the morning and get on back to Sarasota. Roberts Bay is also where we encounter the Chicago colony, kind of started by Bertha Palmer, but amazingly expanded over the years. And so you see the Field Club from the Bayfront, and this was the home of Stanley and Sarah Field. It was built in 1927. It was called Wealaka, which means laughing waters. So here again, the focus is on the bay and the waters. And then just south of there, Immokalee, the home of Honore and Grace Palmer. Honore was the son of Bertha Palmer. And then down south of Philippi Creek, Mabel Lynn, another Chicago socialite, had originally purchased the property there south of Philippi Creek and then sold it to Edson and Nettie Keith, also from Chicago, who built what we now know as the Keith Mansion at Philippi Estate Park. And then a little bit further south in Osprey, of course, Bertha Palmer with the Oaks and what's now historic Spanish Point campus, but all these folks were from Chicago. And then where the Ide Center is today, down just a little bit south of Vamo, actually a little bit north of there, was Barney's Alligator Farm, the first tourist attraction. So anyway, people would go down there in 1910 and check out the alligators. So here's the Field Club home, Wealaka, from the Bayfront. Gorgeous 1920s era home, designed over the water. There's a lagoon that goes through to a big lagoon in the back. I think you can see that here. So here's the primary residence. Here's the lagoon that comes through. The boathouse was back in here. So all very sheltered boating water. Nice little article about the Stanley Fields of Chicago coming down and spending time at Immokalee, the home of Honore Palmer, which is practically next door. This is where the Landings subdivision is today. And again, you might have seen this image if you saw our Gardens of the Region program, because this was another one of those beauty spots in Sarasota in the early years. And then the home of Edson Keith, now called the Philippi Estate Mansion. And this image was taken from the top of their water tower, which is kind of cool. You can see they had kind of a farm going here. You can see all their vegetable farm is all plowed up and ready to go. This was one of the very first buildings with a barrel tile roof and with stucco and stuff like that, starting that Mediterranean style. And then look in the background north of Philippi Creek, you just don't see anything but trees. And so that's kind of Roberts Bay for you. Now, I do want to point out before we go into Little Sarasota Bay that there is another Roberts Bay in Sarasota County, and that's down by Venice. And that one is named for a gentleman named Robert Rickert Roberts. And he was the early pioneer down there in the 80s. And so his Roberts Bay was named for him. And believe it or not, there is a third Roberts family that's steeped in regional history from the Laurel community. And I'm actually surprised we don't have 3 Roberts Bays along the various waterways. But anyway, I just wanted to clarify that because people might go down to Venice and see Roberts Bay and say, hey, is that Captain Lewis Roberts? No, that's Robert Roberts. Yeah. So, and Marlo, just as we're getting into the questions, I threw this citrus product label in here because it's tied to Roberts Bay because it's an old label from one of the Palmer Company's citrus groves. It's called Philippi River Brand, oranges and grapefruit. I just think it's wonderful. It's got the great white egrets in there and the little creek shoreline. So do we have any other questions?
We do. We have a question about what is the difference between a key and an island? And even today we use like City Island and Bird Key. And what's the difference and how do we use those properly?
I don't think there's any difference in terms of the way we use, we use the term key to describe the islands that we have along the shoreline. I don't know if there's any technical difference. Places like City Island is interesting because most of City Island's man-made. Island Park is interesting because most of all of Island Park is man-made. So it seems like we use key for the natural islands. And then we have like Skiers Island in Roberts Bay, completely man-made when they dredged the Intracoastal Waterway in the 60s. So it seems like, Marlo, just sitting here thinking about it, that islands describe the natural barrier islands. Keys are the name we use for the natural barrier islands, and then we use the term islands for the ones that we make.
That's a good one. I had heard to use them interchangeably, so I like your answer better.
Well, I think you can. And I would also point out that if you go to the East Coast, they use the term river to describe what we use to describe the bay. So they have the Indian River Lagoon, which would be the same as what we would call Sarasota Bay. So it's kind of interesting, just even over on the East Coast of Florida, they use different terminology to describe these estuarine environments,
Yeah, interesting. Well, we don't have a question at the moment, and you may be getting into this later, but do you want to say anything about the boat building that happens down at Historic Spanish Point?
Well, sure, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but the fact is that Marie Selby Botanical Gardens has wonderful volunteers that do all sorts of things, from helping to take care of the plants in the gardens, to helping with the botanical collections, to helping with all of our events. But at the Historic Spanish Point campus, we have a group of volunteers who love to work on and build boats. And so they are kind of reliving a tradition that's gone on at that campus since the middle 1870s. And right on the exact same location of the original Pioneer Boatyard. And they use a lot of traditional methods in addition to some modern ones for safety. And it's an amazing thing where, the Magic Tour boat was actually built right there at the boatyard by the volunteers. It's captained by U.S. Coast Guard certified captains who are volunteers. The first mates are volunteered. All the maintenance is done by volunteers. It is an amazing program that I think when you think about building boats in a boatyard, there aren't that many old boatyards left in Florida, let's face it. And then those same boats are used to take people out on the bay. That's just amazing to me. So, and we're always building and fixing up boats. So there's always something going on down there.
Yeah, so they're really beautiful. Well, I heard today on the news, SNN did a wonderful spot on the Selbys, primarily Mr. Selby, but they said that Marie was the mechanic of the family. So I know she worked on their race cars. I wondered if she ever worked on Belma. We'll have to find out.
Well, it would not surprise me at all. And I think it'd be great if we could research that a little bit more, learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear some more about our bays and our next stop.
Well, Little Sarasota Bay, and I didn't have any place to put this photo, so I threw it into my title slide here. This is the little paddle wheel boat that used to give people rides at Florida Land. Florida Land was a tourist attraction a little bit south of Historic Spanish Point campus, where South Bay Yacht and Racquet Club is today. And it had all sorts of things. It had a Wild West town. It had a petting zoo. It had all sorts of things that you could see and do there. And they had the dolphins, jumping dolphins and things like that, the dolphin shows. But they had this Harbor Queen, as they called it. And Florida Land is famous for having closed the same year that Disney opened. They just figured they weren't going to be able to compete. And again, now that's South Bay Yacht and Racket Club. But I wanted to show this photograph. This is a 1940s, I think, image of Siesta Key. And so you're looking at the north end of the key up here. You've got South Lido up here at the very top of the screen, and actually even Longboat at the very top of the screen. But this is the expanse of Siesta Key. This is Point of Rocks right here in the middle, this very prominent historical landmark, maritime landmark for decades. And this map also shows the old Little Sarasota Pass, which was what connected Osprey to the Gulf of Mexico. This would have been the pass that the Webb family would have used to go out into the Gulf of Mexico. And it is shown here closed off. This closed off with the 1926 hurricane. It actually filled in the north part of this pass. This is right where the Sanderling Beach Club cabanas are now. This is all part of the Sanderling Club. And then this is all Roberts Bay up here, the bay that we just talked about. We can see it all. Here's the Bird Colony Islands. Here's Clam Bar. You know, this is pre-1968 intracoastal waterway dredging. So we're seeing basically the result of the 1911 dredging through the mangroves right here. So this is all the mangroves, you know. And then now we're into Little Sarasota Bay down here, and this is Stickney Point right here. So Stickney Point's a major landmark and something worth talking about, but I thought you might enjoy seeing Siesta Key pre-World War II. You know, there were homes out there, but you just don't see a lot of them. And this is the Stickney Point Bridge, identical to the Blackburn Point Bridge. They were both purchased at the same time. This was the first capital improvement project undertaken by Sarasota County government when they became a county in 1921. They wanted to link up with a second bridge on Siesta Key, and they wanted to link up with a bridge to Casey Key. And so this, I think, is a wonderful old photograph of this swing bridge that would pivot in the center, and it was a mechanical pivot. The bridge tender would have to go out and turn it by hand, and then ultimately both these bridges were electrified. The Blackburn Point Bridge is still there. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and the community there on Casey Key wanted to see it preserved instead of having a higher bridge, and so they were able to make that possible. And I understand that the old Stickney Point Bridge is down in the Caribbean connecting two islands, that they sold it. It's still in use down there. So maybe somebody will find it down there one day and send us back a photograph. And so Stickney Point, Uncle Ben Stickney, he was beloved by all of Sarasota. He had come here from Missouri. His father had been very much involved in the extension of the railroads from east to west coast. Ben Stickney was a hotel keeper in Missouri and St. Louis, but he came to Sarasota to kind of get it away from it all, and he settled way down on that south end of what at the time was called Little Sarasota Key. And people called him a hermit, but the funny thing about that is that he was a hotel keeper, and he hosted a picnic every Sunday afternoon pretty much the whole time he was down there until the day he died. And this is the little home place. He had this little round concrete block fountain here. And then there's another great photograph of a big picnic where everybody brought good things to eat. They're underneath the shade of those live oak trees. And you see all the epiphytes up in there, the Spanish moss, the resurrection ferns, you practically see the orchids up in there, you know. And there's lots of interesting people in this image. On the far left is Carrie Abbey. She was the postmistress at the time. In the very middle, just to the left of the woman who's wearing the dark shawl, there's Rose Wilson. She was the editor of the newspaper from 1910 on for another decade. The gentleman to the right with the black hat's Thomas Yarbrough. He was the superintendent of education here. So, you know, everybody in Sarasota would go down to Uncle Ben Stickney's, and he passed away in 1912, but the name stuck on the place, and it's stuck on the point, it's stuck on the bridge, and it's on a road as well. So going back to the 1883 map, we're going to take a little trip here down into Little Sarasota Bay. Again, we just saw this on the aerial photograph, the Point of Rocks out here on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side, the old Little Sarasota Inlet coming in. And then if you switch over to the right-hand side, I kind of tried to put a match line with the little yellow line there because there was no way I could fit this long bay into one slide. And you come down, you see all these shoals coming across. These were all impediments to early navigation. And then you come way down, oops, whoops, whoops. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. And then look at this, another bird island. This is what's now called the Jim Neville Marine Preserve. This was donated by the Palmer family to the county at the same time that the historic Spanish Point campus was donated. And this is all to remain in its natural state. And it's a beautiful area out here. And here's the southern entrance to the Little Sarasota Pass, coming in right where a lot of people remember Midnight Pass. But this is actually, this whole thing that a lot of people call Midnight Pass today is the original entrance to Little Sarasota Pass. And then there was this little Bird Island Pass here. When the Webb family first came down from New York in the 1860s to settle what's now the historic Spanish Point campus, they would go over to these bird rookery islands and they would harvest eggs. They would go and get a bucket of eggs every week, and they really didn't have to worry about chickens. But right here is historic Spanish Point. You see it extending out into the bay. You see North Creek named, and it was named by the Webb family when they applied for their post office. They said, well, what are the boundaries? They said, well, from the creek on the north to the creek on the south. And those names stuck, a little bit like New Pass. You also see a little connecting road going up to Sarasota out here to the east. That's kind of interesting. And so if you look at the configuration of this point, the shell mound that, you know, is completely constructed out into the bay, and then you look over on this side, there's another little point coming this way. Well, this is because years and years of storms coming through would blow that sand out. But it makes you wonder if the early people at Spanish Point were trying to make a connection over here, and then they could get all the way out to the Bear Island to get their turtle eggs and hunt turtles and do all those things that they might want to do. So we will never know. And then here we are right down in the little cove there, just south of the point. This is the Ruby. This is the first schooner that the Webb family purchased when they first came down from New York. Had 5-ton capacity for hauling, and they took the Ruby to Key West and to Cedar Key to sell all their citrus and vegetables and whatever else they had to sell. And they ultimately sold the Ruby to the Whitaker family when they built a larger schooner. And that was all made possible when they met this man standing on the left in the boat with the white jeans on and then the suspenders, and that's Frank Guptill, who started sailing the 7 seas when he was 12 years old, ultimately ended up in Jacksonville in 1874, was hired to salvage a wreck off of Longboat Key, needed locals' help in finding it. The Webbs helped him find that boat, and he ended up coming down and starting a boatyard on their property, fell in love with and married their daughter, Lizzie, who's standing next to him there, holding the mast there. And this is just a great little shot, actually over on the north end of Casey Key, with Little Sarasota Pass, the waterway that you're seeing, the southern end of Siesta Key, which is where the Point condo is now behind them. And then Osprey way in the distance back here. But anyway, Frank Guptill started building many, many boats. This is where the set sail with Selby docks today at the packing house. And here's one of the boats that Frank didn't make the boat originally, but he substantially rebuilt this boat there at the boatyard. And here it is right out in front of the packing house. This is one of the only photographs we have of the original packing house. And I just think it's fantastic to see the Phantom. The Phantom operated into the 1930s in this area. So, and I think she actually finally sunk up in Safety Harbor. And then this is the original Frank Guptill boatyard at what's now the historic Spanish Point campus, down at the base of the big archaic shell ring, the 5,000-year-old shell mound. And you can see it's just made out of, you know, logs and palm thatch. But we've been looking at some other photographs recently, and it seems like this evolved over time, and it ended up being more of a flat-roofed lean-to structure over time, more formalized, a little bit more like it is now. But this is a scow schooner actually in the boat shed at this point in time. And this photograph is approximately 1901. And the scow schooner would have been a very wide, shallow draft boat that would have been used, again, to haul fish and vegetables and everything else. It's interesting because they've taken the cabin off of it and they've got it leaning up over here. So probably going to put the cabin back on. It's also possible that this is Frank Guptill's own boat that he lived in on the bay before he built his own house, because this photograph was taken the same day as a photograph of the house under construction. So maybe it was time to refit this boat. He didn't need to live on it anymore. And where the boatyard is today and where the boatyard was then, Bertha Palmer made gardens. and she had an automobile drive there. She actually had an automobile turnaround so that she could drive her car from her house, the Oaks, all the way down the Bayfront. And if you saw the program, the briefing that we did called Bertha Palmer and Her Love of Gardens, you'll see images of that. But anyway, this I thought was kind of a neat one here, showing the gardens. And of course, the whole idea behind the set sail with Selby is to provide a day-long adventure for families and friends to come out and enjoy both campuses and the 10 miles of bay in between. Because if you think about it, the bays are nothing more than an aquatic garden. All the life in the bay is supported by 3 types of mangroves that grow along that shoreline, actually 4, and 3 types of seagrasses. And there's relationships between those mangroves and seagrasses and water quality and everything else. But that's really what powers up and feeds the whole bay. And so when we think about a botanical garden at the 2 campuses, and then we expand our mind to realize that really the entire bay is just a garden, and it's fueling the fishing industry, it's fueling the tourism industry, it's fueling the housing, real estate. This is really what Sarasota is all about. Sarasota has always been focused on the water. And can you imagine having these 2 wonderful sanctuaries, one in downtown Sarasota, one in Osprey, and then being able to connect the 2. And as Marlo says, it doesn't matter what day you go on the boat, you're going to have a good time. So you get down there, you can kind of check out Bertha Palmer's gardens. You can go down and go to the food truck and get your lunch. And then, downtown campus, oh my gosh, if you haven't been here, you have to come, because the new Welcome Center, the new Science Center, it's coming up out of the ground. So it's not going to be long, and the sanctuaries are going to be even better than before. So it's really kind of easy to get excited about all the things that we do at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens and how all these things are connected. And I wanted to kind of include these 2 slides today because I was so happy to find these views. The upper left-hand corner is a sunset viewed from Hudson Bayou. And this is basically the little tip of the point of Marie Selby's place, Bill and Marie Selby's place here. And then amazingly, I found this sunset view of Osprey showing the point, extending out into the bay. There's like a little white cottage out here, So we do have time for more questions. I hope you've enjoyed the little tour. I think if you combine kind of the history from this tour with all the nature that you see on the tour, and you do learn some history when you're out there as well, but this is really going to bring it home for you, because then you have a better understanding of these 3 different bays and all the different types of things that occurred there over the years. So Marlo, do we have any more questions from our audience?
We do, and I agree. I think that if I took a set sail with Selby tour now, after hearing this presentation, it would make more sense, the importance of the different points of access and how the families were living along the area. A question, and you may want to go back on a map. What were the passes being typically used by the Webb and Guptill families to get into the Gulf?
So it was only Little Sarasota Pass. And let's see if we can go back and show you that in its entirety. They had, the passes were basically New Pass, 1878, Big Sarasota Pass, that is very, very old, and the deepest water pass. And then then coming down, you had Little Sarasota Pass, and then you had Casey's Pass, which now most people would consider Venice Inlet to be Casey's Pass, although Casey's Pass was a little bit further north than where the Venice Jetty is today. But the Webbs, if you look at the green circle down below, here's the point. They would have gone into this, if they were heading out to the Gulf, they would have been gone here. This is 3 miles up this little channel and out here at the south end of Point of Rocks, out into the Gulf of Mexico. And they did this with the original Magic. I found an article in 1917 where they'd gone out to the Grouper Banks. It was like 10 miles out in the Magic. No radio, no cell phone, no latitude and longitude, no navigation, no GPS. They just were going fishing. And so yeah, this is the historic pass. And then in 1921, the hurricane in October blew out this little narrow stretch of beach where I'm running my cursor now. And for 5 years, both this was open as well as the old pass was open. But in 1926 hurricane, it actually filled in the land where Turtle Beach parking lot is now and closed off and separated. So the lower portion of the Little Sarasota Pass is what you now call Turtle Beach Lagoon. And the northern portion of Little Sarasota Pass is what's called Heron Lagoon, and that's in the heart of the Sanderling Club, which is a residential subdivision there on the south end of Siesta Key that was remarkably designed around nature in a very, very special way. So it's a very remarkable place. But yeah, that's the only pass that the Webbs would have had. And again, people think about Midnight Pass, but Midnight Pass didn't open until 1921. Now, if you can imagine sailing out this, you better have the wind coming out of the south, because otherwise you're going to tack back and forth across this. I will tell you that I've spent quite a bit of time in Heron Lagoon myself, and it is about 11 feet deep at its deepest point, and it is a hard bottom. And it's still scoured out from, you know, centuries of being a pass, even though now it's kind of a landlocked waterway, if you will. The only connection now is actually through a culvert out to the bay.
Wow.
So I hope that answers the question, Marlo. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Well, we have no other questions at this time.
Okay.
I really appreciate this. I've learned so much, and I know that those joining me have learned a lot. And the photos are always exceptional and beautiful and just fun. Look back at history, and it makes it really vibrant. So do you know when our next historical briefing is going to be? Is it in November?
It is
We're going to take
November
October
30th.
Mm-hmm.
November 30th, and the topic is going to be, I've selected 3 photographers that have been critical in documenting life in Sarasota. And one of them is from the 1880s, leading up to about the turn of the century. And then the other one is from about 1908 on through the early 20s. And then one is in the 1930s. And I'm really pumped about this one because a lot of people have, you know, seen a lot of photographs, but you don't often see a photographic collection from a historic photographer. And so this is, you know, kind of going along with our theme this year. It's the year of photography here at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. So again, Jennifer kind of inspired me to see what I could do with historical images, and this is what I've come up with. So I'm still working on perfecting the program, but we've got that set up for November 30th. And then we've got some other ideas of other historical briefings coming up as well. So those are going to be exciting topics. And I just love being challenged to do a program on different topics. And there are so many things that relate to what we do and who we are at these 2 Bayfront sanctuaries that it really makes it easy for me to connect us to the regional history that we're so much a part of. And again, just, you know, I really ask people to really seriously realize how lucky we are to have these 2 Bayfront sanctuaries, one, you know, donated by the generosity of the Selby family, the other through the generosity of the Palmer family. Sarasota would not be what it is today had those 2 families not stepped up and done what they did. And then the organizations done what they have done to really bring these 2 campuses alive for the community. This idea of connecting them by boats is just a genius thing to do. And I credit Jennifer with that idea. And I am just so tickled about it because I think it combines everything that we're all about, and it gives people a different perspective. Even just to, when you leave Hudson Bayou, if you can take your eyes off the dolphins for just 5 minutes and look back at Selby Gardens, at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, downtown Sarasota campus, and see the banyan grove and see the wonderful mangroves and see all the tropical flowering vegetation, it just makes you smile. And, you know, it's a contrast to the rest of the Bayfront, right? But it's a complement to the rest of the Bayfront, you know, and without that green space, we wouldn't be Sarasota. So I'm happy to be here. I am tickled pink to be doing the research to put together some programs for our members and our guests, and look forward to the next one. And Marlo, I always appreciate working with you and the other folks who helped me behind the scenes to put together a nice program. So thank you so much for what you do. Thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Well, there's several comments thanking you for a wonderful and informative presentation. As always, you bring a lot of life to the history and make it so interesting. And we look forward to being back with you on November 30th. Until then, everyone, be safe, get out, enjoy Florida, enjoy the water, enjoy Selby Gardens. Thanks so much.